The bottling line hadn't run in 11 years, but when I turned the emergency power valve on the backup generator, the conveyor belt shuddered forward 6 inches and stopped. That small mechanical cough echoing through the darkness of Building C told me everything I needed to know. The bones of this place were still alive. If you care about how this ends, please consider subscribing. That support is what keeps these stories running. My name is Dara Boone. Before the outbreak, I was a process engineer for a beverage distributor in Macon. Not Coca-Cola, but close enough that I understood the architecture of industrial liquid systems. Filtration, pressurization, thermal cycling, sanitation loops. When the world turned and I found myself driving north on I-75 with nothing but a go bag and a stolen Toyota, I wasn't looking for walls or weapons. I was looking for infrastructure. The plant sat just outside Cartersville, 60 miles northwest of Atlanta, straddling a 2-lane road that had already been blocked by a jackknifed propane truck nobody was ever going to move. The fencing was chain link topped with razor wire, standard for any facility that once stored commercial syrup concentrate. The parking lot held 14 vehicles in various states of decay. The loading docks were sealed. Every window above ground level was intact. I circled the perimeter on foot. No bodies. No sign of breach. The infection had swept through Georgia's cities with terrifying speed. But this stretch of semi-rural highway had simply been abandoned in the evacuation. People had driven past on their way to imaginary safety further north and hadn't stopped to consider what they were passing. I got inside through a roof access ladder on the east side of the syrup storage wing, climbed 32 rungs with my pack on my back and a fire axe through my belt loop, and dropped into a corridor that smelled like dust and old sugar. My flashlight beam found a directory sign on the wall. 5 buildings connected by enclosed walkways, a production floor, a water treatment module, a refrigeration block, a quality control laboratory, and the administrative building where someone had left a coffee mug on a desk beside a calendar still showing March 2015. That first night, I barricaded myself inside the QC lab and slept on a sample counter with the axe across my chest. Through the sealed window, I could see the glow of something burning a long way south. Atlanta, still cooking, 30 days into its collapse. I had no illusions about what stood between here and there. I'd driven through the edges of it, seen the stumbling figures choking roads outside Kennesaw, watched a woman in a hospital gown walk directly into traffic on an overpass and not react when a car door struck her shin and spun her sideways. She just pivoted and kept moving, her head tracking the vehicle as it swerved past. That image lived behind my eyelids every time I closed them. But this factory, this dead, forgotten, beautiful factory, was something I hadn't dared hope for. Not a bunker, not a hiding spot. A production facility. A place where raw materials entered one end and finished product exited the other through a fully automated chain of mechanical processes. The Coca-Cola company had spent decades engineering the most efficient liquid processing systems on the planet. And then they had closed this one down and walked away and left all of it standing. I didn't need to defend a resource. I needed to build a capability. There's a difference that almost nobody left alive seemed to understand. On day 2, I mapped every building, every utility conduit, every shut-off valve. I found 800-gallon stainless steel mixing tanks still plumbed to the water treatment system. I found a reverse osmosis array that could purify river water to pharmaceutical grade. I found a carbonation injection module, a heat exchange pasteurizer, and enough food-safe silicon tubing to replicate the circulatory system of a blue whale. I also found, in the maintenance office of Building A, a laminated evacuation map that had confirmed what I'd already suspected. The plant had its own deep well. Drilled in 1987, tapping a clean aquifer 160 feet below the Georgia clay, I sat on the concrete floor with that map in my hands and let myself breathe for the first time in a month. Then I started making a list. The list grew into a blueprint over 72 hours, during which I barely slept. I moved through the facility with a clipboard I'd found in a foreman's locker, cataloging every piece of equipment that could serve a survival function. The carbonation system was irrelevant for its intended purpose, but the CO2 tanks it fed from were full. 9 pressurized cylinders in a caged rack beside the production floor. Carbon dioxide displaces oxygen. In an enclosed space, that's a weapon. In a controlled application, it's a preservation tool, a fire suppressant, a means of creating an oxygen-free atmosphere inside a sealed container where perishable materials can be stored without decay. The pasteurizer was the real prize. A continuous flow heat exchanger designed to bring liquid to 149 degrees Fahrenheit for precisely 30 seconds, enough to kill bacteria without altering flavor. I didn't care about flavor. I cared about sterilization. If I could restore flow to that system using the deep well as a source, I could produce clean water at a rate that dwarfed anything a survivor camp could achieve with bleach tablets and prayer. On day 3, I met Odell. I was outside on the loading dock, prying open a shipping container that I hoped held maintenance supplies, when I heard footsteps on gravel that were too deliberate to be infected. The tern don't modulate their gait. They don't slow down when approaching an unfamiliar surface. This sound included hesitation, and hesitation meant cognition. I dropped behind the container and gripped the axe. "I see your footprints," a voice said. Male, older, unhurried. "They go in, and they don't come out. So either you're dead inside, or you're listening to me right now." He was standing at the southeast corner of the loading area, both hands raised and empty, wearing a canvas jacket and a pack that sat low on his hips. Mid-60s, dark brown skin weathered into deep creases around his mouth and eyes. He had a holstered revolver on his right thigh but hadn't touched it. "I'm Odell Prater," he said. "Retired. Was living in Adairsville until last week. I'm not bit, I'm not crazy, and I've been walking for 4 days. So if you're going to swing that axe at me, I'd appreciate the chance to sit down first." I let him in. That decision was instinctive, and I've examined it many times since, because instinct is the thing that gets you killed fastest in this new world. But Odell carried himself like a man who had decided to remain civilized as a matter of personal policy, not because he expected reciprocity. There's a posture to that kind of resolve, an absence of performance. He'd been a machinist for 31 years at a tool and die shop in Dalton before retiring to a small house with a garden and a dog that had died in the first week. He told me this while sitting on an overturned crate, drinking water I'd purified by running it through the RO filter using a manual hand pump I'd rigged that morning. He drank slowly, watching me over the rim of the bottle, evaluating. "You're not scavenging," he said. "You're engineering. The plant has everything," I told him. Water purification, pressurized gas, heat treatment, sealed storage, industrial refrigeration, if I can get the generator running consistently. This isn't a hiding place. It's a production facility waiting to be repurposed. Odell set down the bottle and looked at the tangle of tubing and valve assemblies I'd laid out across the production floor like surgical instruments. "What exactly are you producing?" "Capability," I said. He nodded slowly, not because he understood yet, but because he recognized the seriousness behind the word. That night, I showed him the full layout. We walked every building by flashlight. I explained what each system could become if we restored it to partial function. He asked mechanical questions, tolerances, seal integrity, electrical load. That told me his 31 years in precision manufacturing hadn't faded. By midnight, he was sketching modifications to the generator's fuel delivery system on the back of a shipping manifest. We didn't discuss whether he was staying. The question had answered itself through competence. By the end of the first week, we had running water, not the municipal kind. Nothing flowed through the old city connection, and we didn't expect it to. But the deep well's manual pump mechanism still functioned, and Odell fabricated an adapter plate that mated it to a salvaged electric motor we pulled from a belt conveyor. Connected to the backup generator on a timed circuit, the motor could draw water from the aquifer into the plant's internal plumbing at roughly 12 gallons per minute. From there, it ran through the reverse osmosis filters, which Odell inspected membrane by membrane, replacing two that had dried out and cracked, and into a 500-gallon holding tank that had once staged purified water before it entered the syrup mixing process. Clean water, on demand, inside a secure perimeter. I stood at the holding tank's sight glass and watched the level climb, and I understood for the first time that survival wasn't going to be my problem. My problem was going to be everyone else. The Cartersville plant sat at the intersection of two realities. To the south, Atlanta was a hot zone, millions of infected grinding through the rubble of a city that had been too dense to evacuate and too sprawling to contain. To the north, a scattered diaspora of survivors had filtered into the Appalachian foothills, forming loose camps in state parks and church grounds and the parking lots of rural Walmarts. They were surviving on canned goods and rainwater and diminishing hope. And they were moving. Every day, small groups drifted along the secondary roads, visible from the factory's upper windows as distant figures picking their way through the landscape like seeds blown from a dead field. We were not isolated. We were centrally located, visible, and increasingly operational. Odell raised this on day 9. Standing at the window of the administrative building's second floor with a pair of binoculars he'd found in a plant manager's desk drawer. 3 more today, he said, heading northwest on Route 411. One of them stopped and looked at our smoke. We'd been running the generator intermittently, and though we'd sealed the exhaust through an existing vent stack, the faint shimmer of heat was apparently visible from the road on cool mornings. A signal we hadn't intended to send. "We can go dark," I said. "No." Odell lowered the binoculars. "We need the generator for the pump and the pasteurizer. Going dark means going back to hand-carrying water and boiling it or it over open flame. An open flame makes more smoke than a vented diesel exhaust. The math doesn't work." He was right. The systems I designed were interdependent. Each one reduced a risk only because the others covered adjacent vulnerabilities. Shut down the generator, and the whole chain collapsed into a pile of inert metal. "Then we have a decision to make," I said. "And it's not the one you think." Odell waited. "The question isn't whether people are going to find us. They are. The question is what we are when they arrive. If we're a bunker, we're a target. If we're a service, we're an asset." He turned from the window and studied me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. The one that meant I'd said something he'd already been thinking and was deciding whether my version matched his. "You want to open the doors. I want to build something that only functions with more people. A system that requires cooperation to operate, not charity, not a shelter. A production chain that makes everyone who participates essential to everyone else." "That's a factory," Odell said. "That's exactly what it is." It was quiet for a long time, watching the distant figures on Route 4 disappear over a low ridge. "My shop in Dalton had 43 employees," he said finally. 43 people who showed up every day because the work needed doing, and the work fed their families, and those two facts held each other up. Wasn't loyalty, wasn't friendship. It was mutual necessity designed into the process. Yes. And when the orders dried up and the shop closed, every one of those people scattered inside a month. Because the design stopped working. So we build a design that doesn't stop working. Odell put the binoculars down and picked up his wrench. "Then we need more hands," he said. "Starting now." We took in the first group on day 12. They came from the south. A family of 4 and a young man traveling alone who had attached himself to them somewhere around Ackworth. The family was Ray and Tomoko Sunderland, and their 2 daughters, ages 14 and 9. The young man's name was Kellen Moore, 23, a former HVAC technician, whose entire set of professional skills became immediately and critically useful the moment he stepped through the loading dock door and saw what we'd built. I need to describe what the plant looked like by then, because it mattered. Odell and I had cleared the main production floor of debris and organized it into functional zones marked with spray-painted lines on the concrete. Zone 1, water processing, anchored by the RO array and the pasteurizer. Zone 2, food storage, built around the refrigeration block that Odell had partially restored using the plant's original ammonia cooling system. Zone 3, the lab, which I'd converted from quality control into a general-purpose workspace with the distillation capability, basic chemistry supplies scavenged from janitorial storage, and a growing library of technical manuals pulled from every office in the complex. Zone 4, habitation, set up in the administrative building's second floor. Her individual offices became private sleeping quarters with lockable doors. It looked like order. In a world that had dissolved into chaos, the sight of labeled zones and clean floors and humming machinery carried a psychological force that I hadn't anticipated. Tomoko Sunderland walked onto the production floor, looked at the overhead lights we'd restored in the central bay, and started crying. Not from sadness, from recognition. She was looking at something that resembled the world she'd lost. Ray was a high school chemistry teacher. Tomoko had managed logistics for a regional grocery chain. Their older daughter, Hana, was quiet and watchful and had a notebook in which she'd been keeping a meticulous daily log of everything that had happened to her family since the outbreak. Their younger daughter, Marin, hadn't spoken in 6 days. Kellen assessed the HVAC system within an hour of arrival and told me the plant's air handling could be restored to positive pressure operation, meaning we could filter incoming air and maintain higher pressure inside the buildings than outside, preventing unfiltered air from leaking in through cracks and gaps. It was a hospital-grade infection control measure, and it was achievable with the equipment already present. The air handlers are oversized for this square footage, he said, tracing ductwork on a ceiling plan. Coca-Cola built this place to maintain clean room conditions on the bottling line. The filtration is already there. I just need to seal the returns and balance the system. He started that afternoon. Odell helped him fabricate sheet metal covers for the return vents they couldn't use. Ray Sunderland, without being asked, walked into the lab and began inventorying every chemical compound on the shelves, cross-referencing them against a mental database of reactions and applications that made me grateful he'd survived. This was the design working, not because I'd assigned roles, but because the facility itself demanded specific competencies, and the people who arrived carried them. The plant was a machine that needed operators, and the apocalypse, in its grotesque lottery, had sent us the right ones. By day 15, we had positive air pressure in buildings A and C, running purified water throughout the central plumbing loop, functional refrigeration in the storage block, and a perimeter alarm system Odell had rigged using tripwire and compressed air horns from the emergency supplies. We also had our first infected inside the fence. Kellen found it at dawn on day 16, a woman in the loading area behind Building D, standing motionless against the corrugated wall. She'd entered through a gap in the chain link where a drainage culvert passed under the perimeter. She was in late-stage progression, skin mottled gray, eyes tracking movement with that terrible mechanical precision, jaw working in a slow, repetitive motion that produced a faint clicking sound. She hadn't attacked because she hadn't detected a direct stimulus. The positive pressure system was pushing our scent away from the, but the breach point existed, and where one walked through, more could follow. We dealt with the infected woman using the CO2 system. I'd spent 2 days adapting one of the carbonation cylinders into a directional displacement tool, a long hose with a flared nozzle that could flood a confined area with carbon dioxide, forcing out breathable air. The infected still needed oxygen to fuel the motor functions that kept them moving. Remove the oxygen and they collapsed within 90 seconds. They didn't die. We'd learned that from radio reports out of Fort Benning before the military broadcasts went silent. But they entered a dormant state that could last hours. Odell and I approached from upwind, flooded the drainage culvert exit with CO2, and watched the woman slump against the wall and slide to the ground. Then we sealed the culvert with steel plate and welded it shut. "That's not a permanent solution," Ray said when we told the group what had happened. We were gathered on the production floor for what had become a daily operational meeting, another emergent structure that nobody had formally proposed, but everyone attended. If they're finding gaps in the perimeter, we need a systematic survey. Already started, Odell said. He unrolled a hand-drawn site plan on a workbench. Red circles marked every potential breach point he'd identified. 17 in total. Drainage culverts, gate hinges weakened by rust, a section of fence where a fallen tree had bent the top rail low enough to climb. Kellen and I can seal the critical ones this week. The rest need materials we don't have. What materials? Tomoko asked. She'd assumed responsibility for resource tracking with the same systematic precision she'd once applied to grocery logistics, maintaining a running inventory on a whiteboard mounted near the lab entrance. Welding rod. We're burning through what was left in the maintenance shop. And concrete mix for the culvert footings. There's a Home Depot in Cartersville, Kellen said. 3 miles east. The room shifted. Everyone understood what 3 miles east meant. 3 miles of open road through a town that had been partially evacuated and partially consumed, where the density of infected was unknown, and the risk was real. I'll go, Kellen said. Not alone, I told him. I'm the fastest. Speed isn't the variable that matters. Cargo capacity is. You need a vehicle, and you need someone to keep it running while you load. Ray stood up. I'll drive. Tomoko's hand found his forearm. Not gripping. Resting. A touch that contained an entire conversation about risk and responsibility and the 2 children sleeping upstairs. Ray covered her hand with his and met her eyes, and something passed between them that I had no right to interpret, but its conclusion was clear. I'll drive, he said again, quieter. They left at first light the next morning in a pickup truck we'd found with a quarter tank of gas behind Building E. Odell had tuned the engine the night before, replacing a corroded battery terminal and priming the fuel system. I gave them 2 CO2 canisters with nozzle attachments and a pair of 2-way radios from the plant's internal communication system, range roughly 2 miles. The plan was simple. Drive to the Home Depot, enter through the garden center, which faced away from the main road, load welding supplies and concrete, return. 90 minutes maximum. They were gone for 4 hours. The first radio contact came at 40 minutes. Kellen's voice, tightly controlled. Store is accessible. Loading now. Moderate foot traffic on the north side. Keeping quiet. Foot traffic. The euphemism we'd all adopted for the infected wandering through commercial areas, drawn to some residual pattern of pre-collapse movement, clustering near parking lots and intersections as though waiting for a signal that was never going to come. The second radio contact came at 2 hours and 10 minutes. Ray's voice this time, strained. Vehicle won't start. Working on it. Don't come. I looked at Odell. Odell looked at the welding torch he'd been using to seal a culvert bracket and set it down. Don't come means come, he said. Don't come means he's protecting us from a decision we should make ourselves. Same thing. I picked up the radio. Ray, talk to me. Silence. Then Kellen's voice, barely above a whisper. We have a situation. Odell and I reached the Home Depot in 22 minutes on foot, approaching from the south through a residential neighborhood where the houses stood open and silent, doors ajar, lawns overgrown into knee-high meadows. We could see the store's roofline above the tree canopy 2 blocks before we reached the parking lot, and we could hear what was happening before we saw it. Not the infected. People. There were 11 of them, spread across the garden center entrance and the adjacent loading area. They had 2 trucks, a sedan, and a configuration that wasn't random. 3 posted at visible corners, 2 at the vehicles, the rest inside. Organized, armed, operating with the kind of spatial discipline that suggested either military background or weeks of practiced coordination. Ray's pickup was parked near the garden center gate with its hood up. Through the binoculars, I could see Ray standing beside it, hands at his sides, talking to a tall woman in a tactical vest who was listening with her arms crossed. Kellen was nowhere visible. That's not a raiding party, Odell said quietly, studying the formation. Raiders don't post sentries facing outward. They post them facing the people they're robbing. He was right. The sentries were watching the perimeter roads, not Ray. Their concern was external threats, not internal control. This was a group protecting an operation, not conducting a robbery. Stay here, I said. No. Odell, I've been black in Georgia for 64 years. I know exactly what walking into an armed group of strangers looks like from every possible angle. You don't go alone. We walked in together, hands visible, moving slowly, directly toward the woman talking to Ray. She saw us coming from 50 yards and shifted her weight but didn't raise her weapon. Up close, she was mid-40s, angular, sunburned, with short cropped hair and eyes that performed a complete tactical assessment in the 2 seconds it took us to close the last 10 feet. More of yours? She said to Ray. My people, I confirmed. Your people. She repeated it neutrally, tasting the possessive. I'm Sergeant Io Osei, Georgia National Guard, or what's left of the concept. We've been using this location as a supply point for 3 weeks. We didn't know. Obviously, your man here drove in, started loading concrete, and triggered an alarm we rigged on the garden center gate. Nobody got hostile. We're having a conversation. Kellen emerged from inside the store, walking beside a guard who looked barely 20. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. Unharmed. Not coerced. Where are you operating from? Osei asked. I made the decision in the space between her question and my breath, and it was the most consequential decision I'd made since entering the factory. The old Coca-Cola plant, west on 411. We've restored water purification and refrigeration. We're rebuilding it as a production facility. Osei's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. I'd seen the same look on mechanical systems when a new input altered the entire operating state. A click, a realignment, a different mode engaging. How many in your group? 7. 2 of them are children. We're 31, down from 48 when we started. We have medical supplies, ammunition, and 3 people with combat training. What we don't have is clean water. Our purification tablets ran out 8 days ago, and we've been boiling creek water over open fires that attract every walking corpse in a 5-mile radius. There it was. The geometry I'd anticipated when I told Odell we needed to be a service rather than a bunker. Not charity, not alliance. Structural interdependence. They had what we lacked. Security, manpower, medical capability. We had what they lacked. The industrial infrastructure to produce the most essential substance on Earth. Your truck needs a new starter relay, Odell said to Ray, who was still standing beside the open hood. I can see it from here. 15-minute fix if they have one inside. Osei looked at Odell, then at me, then at the store behind her, where a wall of automotive supplies gleamed under the emergency skylights. Fix the truck, she said. Then let's talk about water. Osei brought 12 of her people to the plant the next day. Not all 31. She was too disciplined for that. She sent a scouting element first. 3 soldiers who walked the perimeter, inspected the buildings, checked sight lines, and reported back. Only then did she arrive with the main group, riding in 2 military cargo trucks that rumbled through the main gate and parked on the loading apron with the kind of precision that made Odell smile faintly. The remaining 19 stayed at their base camp in a church compound near the Home Depot, maintaining what Osei called distributed posture. If one location fell, the other survived. It was sound thinking, and it told me she'd been planning for loss since the beginning. The 12 she brought were selected for function. 2 combat medics, a communications specialist, 3 infantry-trained soldiers who could build or break almost anything, a former county water department supervisor named Grace Yoon, who stared at the RO array for 5 minutes without speaking, and then said, "You're running the membranes at too high a pressure and you're going to burn them out inside a month." And 5 general-purpose survivors whose primary qualification was that Osei trusted them with her life. Grace was right about the membranes. I'd been running the system at the factory's original operating pressure. which was designed for high-volume commercial output, not sustainable long-term use. She recalculated the flow rate, reduced the pressure by 30%, and extended the projected membrane life from weeks to over a year. In the same afternoon, she identified a secondary filtration path using sand and activated carbon that could serve as a pre-treatment stage, reducing the load on the RO membranes and improving output quality. I watched her work and felt something I hadn't experienced since the outbreak: professional humility. I was a competent engineer operating outside my precise specialty. Grace was a water treatment expert operating inside hers. The difference was measurable in every adjustment she made. By the end of day 2, we'd reorganized the entire production floor. Jose's people brought material discipline. Everything stored uniformly, labeled clearly, accessible without searching. Our people brought system knowledge, where every valve led, what every panel controlled, which circuits were live and which were dead. The integration wasn't seamless. There were disagreements about priority, about resource allocation, about who had authority over which decisions. But the disagreements had structure. They happened in the daily meetings, which now included 20 people sitting on crates and overturned buckets in a rough circle on the production floor. And they were resolved through a process that emerged organically from the collision of military hierarchy and civilian pragmatism. Jose didn't try to take command. This surprised me until I understood her reasoning. "I command soldiers," she told me on the third evening, standing on the roof of Building A where we'd established a watch position. "Down there is a factory. Factories don't need commanders. They need operators and a production schedule. And security. Security is my department. Everything inside the fence line that involves a weapon or a watch rotation goes through me. Everything that involves a valve or a circuit goes through you. Everything that involves resource tracking goes through Tomoko. Everything that involves the water system goes through Grace. Clear lanes, no overlap. What happens when the lanes cross? We talk, like adults, which is apparently a skill rarer than clean water in the current environment." She wasn't wrong. I'd heard enough radio chatter from other survivor groups, before the frequencies went mostly silent, to know that the standard collapse pattern was internal. Groups didn't fall to the infected. They fell to arguments about power that escalated until someone left or someone didn't get the chance to. Jose's model prevented that by making authority functional rather than hierarchical. You didn't lead people. You led a process. And the process was visible, measurable, and accountable to everyone who depended on its output. On the 4th day after integration, we produced our first full run of purified water, using the restored pasteurization loop at operational capacity. 300 gallons, tested by Ray using reagents from the lab, certified clean. Grace marked the holding tank with a grease pencil. Run 01. Tomoko logged it on the whiteboard. And Marin Sunderland, who had not spoken in 23 days, pointed at the tank and said, "Can I have some?" Marin's first words broke something open in the group that I hadn't realized was sealed shut. We'd been operating in a mode of functional efficiency. Solve problems, seal breaches, produce water, maintain security. Every interaction was task-oriented. Every conversation had a deliverable. We'd built a system, and the system was working. But the system had no room in it for a 9-year-old girl who just wanted a drink of water and asked for it like a human being. Tomoko held Marin for a long time after that. Ray poured her a cup from the holding tank, and she drank it slowly, watching the production floor with wide eyes, and then she asked if she could help. Hana, who'd been maintaining her journal with fierce discipline throughout everything, wrote an entry that evening that she later showed me. One sentence: "Marin talked today, and it sounded like the world starting over." We gave both girls jobs, not invented tasks. Real responsibilities scaled to their capability. Hana became the plant's official record keeper, documenting daily production numbers, inventory changes, personnel movements, and maintenance activities in a logbook that grew into the most comprehensive account of our operations that existed. Marin worked with Tomoko on resource tracking, counting inventory items and updating tallies on the whiteboard with handwriting that started shaky and grew steadily more precise. This mattered beyond sentimentality. When children have roles in a functioning system, the adults around them behave differently. The casual cruelties that stress produces, snapping at someone over a minor mistake, hoarding a slightly better sleeping spot, taking an extra portion and pretending you didn't. Those behaviors diminish when a child is watching you and recording what happens in a logbook. Hana's journal was an act of observation. An observation is a form of accountability. The system expanded. By day 25 in the plant, roughly 60 days post-outbreak, we were producing 500 gallons of purified water daily, storing it in repurposed syrup tanks, and running a secondary line that produced a weak sodium hypochlorite solution using electrolysis equipment Ray had assembled in the lab from salvaged components. Bleach, the single most important chemical compound in post-collapse sanitation, and we were manufacturing it. Osei's security team had sealed 15 of the 17 perimeter breach points and established a watch rotation that covered all 4 compass points from elevated positions. The 2 remaining breaches were in a section of fencing backed by dense woodland, and rather than seal them, Osei had turned them into monitored funnels, channeled approaches where anything entering would be detected and could be dealt with using the CO2 displacement system before it reached the buildings. We lost no one in those first weeks. This fact carried a weight that pressed down on every good day, because everyone understood that loss was not a question of whether. It was a question of what form it would take. The form it took was not an attack. It was an arrival. On day 28, a pickup truck with a white bedsheet tied to its antenna drove slowly up Route 411 and stopped at our main gate. Inside were 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s, gaunt and dehydrated but not desperate. Composed, they asked to speak with whoever was in charge, and when Osei and I both approached, they didn't seem confused by the dual authority. They seemed prepared for it. "We're from a settlement east of here," the woman said. Her name was Bree Talbot. "About 40 people in a school building outside Jasper. We heard your generator running 3 days ago, and we've been watching since. Watching, not approaching. Observing our patterns, our security, our output." This was reconnaissance dressed in a white flag. "What do you need?" I asked. "Water," Bree said. "Same as everyone. But we're not here to ask for charity. We have fuel, 38 gallons of diesel we've been saving. We want to trade. 38 gallons of diesel would run our generator for approximately 6 days. 6 days of continuous water production at current capacity would yield 3,000 gallons, enough to supply their 40 people for weeks. The math was straightforward. The implications were not. We'd just become an economy. Trade changed everything, not immediately and not dramatically. The shift was structural, like a building settling onto a new foundation. When Bree's group drove away with 200 gallons of purified water loaded into jerry cans and plastic drums, and we poured their 38 gallons of diesel into our generator's fuel tank, a transaction had occurred that both sides could measure and verify. No trust required, no promises extracted. Just an exchange of material value that left both parties quantifiably better off than before. Within 2 weeks, 3 more groups made contact. A cluster of survivors in a former veterinary clinic near Elijah sent a runner, a teenage boy named Asa, who traveled 14 miles on a bicycle to ask if the rumors about clean water were true. A family compound in the mountains south of Blue Ridge offered canned food and ammunition in exchange for water and bleach. A solo mechanic named Fitz, who'd been maintaining vehicles for scattered groups across a 50-mile radius, simply drove in one morning and said he'd work for us full-time if we'd give him a roof and 3 meals. We gave Fitz a bay in Building D, and he had our second vehicle running within a day. Then he started on a third. His logic was the same as mine. Capability, not just survival. Every functioning vehicle extended our operational range and our ability to deliver product Product. I noticed when I started using that word, and I let it stand. We were producing goods that other people needed, transporting them across distance, and receiving compensation that fueled further production. The vocabulary of commerce wasn't a metaphor. It was a description. Tomoko formalized the system. She created a ledger. An actual double-entry ledger, the kind she'd maintained in her logistics career. Tracking every inbound and outbound resource. Water out, diesel in. Bleach out, canned goods in. Labor hours contributed. Sleeping quarters and meals provided. Every transaction recorded, visible to anyone who wanted to inspect it, balanced to the unit. "This is money," Odell said, studying the ledger one evening. "You've built money without currency." "It's a credit system," Tomoko corrected. "Currency implies abstraction. This tracks actual goods. Same engine, different fuel." He was right. And the distinction Tomoko drew was important precisely because maintaining it was what prevented the system from becoming exploitative. As long as every entry in the ledger corresponded to a physical reality. Gallons produced, calories consumed, hours worked. No one could inflate their position through manipulation. The ledger was anchored to the material world, and the material world doesn't negotiate. Osei watched this development with a strategic eye that I initially misread as suspicion. "You're worried about it," I said. "I'm thinking about it," she corrected. "Every system that provides something essential becomes a target for someone who wants to control that provision. We're not a bunker anymore. We're an engine. And engines attract mechanics, but they also attract people who want to sit in the driver's seat. That's why the system is distributed," I said. "Grace runs water. Kellen runs air. Odell runs fabrication. Ray runs the lab. You run security. Tomoko runs logistics. I run process integration. No single person controls enough to leverage the whole operation. And what happens when someone from outside the plant, someone with 100 people and guns, decides they'd rather own the engine than trade with it?" I didn't have an answer, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because every answer I'd constructed felt insufficient against the scale of the question. "We make the engine too complex to operate by force," I said finally. "Every piece of this system requires specialized knowledge, held by different people. Seize the plant, and you get buildings full of equipment you can't run. Cooperate with the plant, and you get clean water and bleach and refrigerated food storage and vehicle maintenance. That works," Osei said, "until someone decides they'd rather have no water than let you control the supply. Nobody's that irrational." She looked at me with an expression that contained the entirety of human history. "Dara," she said, "everyone is that irrational. The question is how long it takes them to get there." The convoy arrived on day 41. 17 vehicles, trucks, SUVs, 2 repurposed school buses with steel plates welded over the windows. They came from the south on I-75, turned west onto 411, and parked in a line along the road facing our main gate. No white flag, no advance runner. They just materialized in the morning light, like an equation solving itself into a conclusion I should have predicted. I counted from the rooftop, approximately 80 people, maybe more in the buses. They were organized but not military. The formation was loose. The spacing between vehicles inconsistent. The postures of the visible individuals varied from disciplined to restless. A coalition, not a unit. Multiple groups merged under a single authority. That authority stepped out of the lead vehicle alone. His name, we learned later, was Mercer. Just Mercer. No first name offered, no rank, no credential. A wiry man in his 50s with a shaved head and a calm, pastoral bearing that reminded me of a youth minister I'd known as a teenager. He walked to within 30 feet of our gate, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked up at Osei's sentry position with a pleasantest expression. "We need to have a conversation," he said. "And I'd prefer to have it sitting down." Osei came down. So did I. We met him at the gate with 4 armed personnel visible, and the rest positioned where they could respond to any movement from the convoy. Mercer seemed unbothered by the display. He sat on an overturned pallet, accepted a cup of water that Odell brought without being asked. A deliberate gesture of hospitality that also demonstrated what we had. And explained his position. He'd consolidated several survivor groups from south of Atlanta into what he called a cooperative. They'd been moving north for 2 weeks, scavenging and recruiting, absorbing smaller camps by offering protection and numbers. His pitch was simple. The world had reorganized around scarcity, and scarcity rewarded scale. Bigger groups could secure more territory, gather more resources, and defend against larger threats. He was building something permanent, and he wanted us to join it. Join how? Osei asked. Full integration. Your facility, your people, your production capability. Folded into the cooperative. In exchange, you get 80 additional bodies for security, labor, and defense. The combined group operates this plant as its anchor point and expands from here. Under whose authority? Mercer smiled. It was practiced and warm, and it reached his eyes, which was what made it dangerous. Mine, for now, until we're large enough to formalize governance. Then we build institutions, elections, councils, whatever the group decides. For now could last a long time, I said. It could, but so could the alternative, which is that your 38 people sit inside this fence producing water for a region that's going to keep getting hungrier and more desperate until someone less polite than me decides to come take it. He wasn't threatening. He was forecasting. And the forecast was accurate, which was worse. Osei and I excused ourselves and convened an emergency meeting on the production floor. Everyone attended. All 38 of us, including Hannah and Marin, because we'd established early that operational decisions were made in full transparency. I explained Mercer's proposal. Osei assessed the military reality. We can't fight 80 people, she said flatly. Even with defensive position and the CO2 systems, a sustained assault from a force that size would overwhelm us within hours. Our advantages, our infrastructure, not firepower. So we negotiate, Grace said. You can't negotiate from a position of weakness, Kellen countered. In whiteboard, where the inventory ledger gleamed under the overhead lights. You can't negotiate from a position of dependence. Weakness and dependence are different things. We're weaker than Mercer's group militarily, but Mercer's group is dependent on what we produce. He told us that himself. He came here because he needs water. He needs the plant, Osei corrected, not us. Exactly, Tomoko said. So we need to make those the same thing. The negotiation lasted 3 days, not at a table. That wasn't how the world worked anymore. It happened in stages, each one a carefully managed demonstration designed to shift Mercer's calculation about what integration would actually require. Stage 1. I invited Mercer and 3 of his senior people on a full tour of the facility. I showed them everything. The water processing line, the pasteurizer, the RO array, the bleach production lab, the refrigeration system, the CO2 perimeter defense, the air handling, the generator setup, the deep well. I explained every system in technical detail that I calibrated to be thorough enough to be impressive and complex enough to be intimidating. Grace walked them through water treatment. Ray demonstrated the electrolysis setup. Kellen explained positive pressure air handling in terms that made Mercer's technical advisor, a former auto plant foreman named Doyle, visibly recalculate his assumptions about how easy it would be to operate the facility with different personnel. This isn't a water filter, Doyle told Mercer afterward, in a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear but did. It's an integrated system. Kill one piece and the whole thing stops. The people running it are the documentation. Stage 2. Tomoko presented the ledger. She showed Mercer every trade we'd made, every resource we'd received, every outflow of product. She showed him the network of relationships with external groups, the Jasper settlement, the LJ clinic, the mountain compound, Fitz's vehicle maintenance operation. She showed him, in precise numerical terms, that the plant's value wasn't contained within its fence line. It radiated outward through a web of mutual dependencies that would collapse if the plant's operating team was disrupted. "You can take this building," she said, tapping the whiteboard. "But the moment you do, 6 external groups stop trading with you because their relationship is with us, not with the building. And their diesel, their food, their ammunition, that's what keeps this place running." Stage 3 was Ose's. She took Mercer to the roof of Building A at sunset and showed him the perimeter defenses. Then she showed him what was beyond the perimeter. Through binoculars, to the south, the distant glow of Atlanta's perpetual fires. To the east, the dark mass of forest where infected roamed in patterns that shifted with weather and season. To the north, the hills where survivor groups watched and waited and calculated their next move. "Every group within 50 miles knows this plant exists," Ose said. "If you absorb us by force, you announce to all of them that negotiation doesn't work, and the only option is military action. You'll have a war on 3 fronts within a month. If you cooperate with us as a partner, not a subordinate, a partner, you gain access to everything we produce, and you project strength through stability instead of conquest." Mercer stood on that roof for a long time, scanning the horizon with the binoculars, performing calculations I could only estimate. "What does partnership look like?" he asked. "You maintain your people at your own base of operations. We supply water and bleach at a fixed rate in exchange for security support and resource sharing. Joint defense agreements for the perimeter zone. 3 miles in every direction. Disputes resolved in a combined council with equal representation. No absorption, no hierarchy. Parallel structures with shared interests. You're describing an alliance." "I'm describing a supply chain," Ose said. "Alliances break, supply chains adapt." Mercer lowered the binoculars and looked at her. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression that wasn't calculation. It was recognition. He was seeing a strategic mind that operated in the same language as his own, but had reached a different conclusion about how to deploy it. "I need to talk to my people," he said. "Take your time. We'll keep producing water either way." That last sentence was the pivot, a statement of operational independence wrapped in courtesy. We weren't asking for his partnership, we were offering it. And the distinction between those two postures was the distance between a negotiation and a surrender. He took 2 days. Then he came back and said yes. The partnership formalized on day 47. Tomoko drafted a resource-sharing agreement on the back of a shipping manifest. 5 pages of handwritten terms that specified quantities, delivery schedules, security protocols, dispute resolution mechanisms, and termination conditions. Both sides signed. Both sides kept copies. It held for 11 days. The fracture didn't come from Mercer. It came from inside his coalition, from the seams he'd papered over during his march north, where groups he'd absorbed through promises of safety now questioned why they were working to support a factory they couldn't control. A man named Harkin, who'd led a group of 23 before merging with Mercer's coalition, drove to our gate on day 58 and delivered an ultimatum that Mercer hadn't authorized. Provide water directly to his subgroup at a separate rate, or he'd blockade Route 411 and cut off our trade access to the eastern settlements. Jose's sentries reported the confrontation. I went to the gate. Harkin was a compact, muscular man, with a beard grown past the point of intention, and eyes that vibrated between anger and fear with no middle state. He had 8 people with him, armed, arranged behind his truck in a formation that mimicked military positioning badly enough to be recognizable and dangerous. "Mercer doesn't speak for us," Harkin said. "He brought us in under conditions he hasn't kept. We were promised equal access. We're getting filtered water through his distribution, and his people get first draw. That's an internal issue in your coalition," I said. "We deliver water to the agreed point. Distribution after that is your structure's responsibility. Our structure is broken. I'm building a new one." Behind me, I could hear Ose repositioning people. Not aggressively, just adjusting the geometry so that our response options were open. Kellen was on the roof with a CO2 line trained on the gate approach. Odell stood near the loading dock with a calm expression and a pipe wrench that could break concrete. "Hearken, what do you actually need right now today?" He blinked. The question was too simple for the confrontation he'd prepared for. "Water. For 23 people who haven't had clean water in 2 days, because Mercer's distribution team prioritized their own. I can give you 50 gallons right now. From our current stock, not part of the Mercer agreement. A separate allocation documented in our ledger as a direct provision to your group, repayable in labor or trade goods at a time of your choosing. You'd do that. The plant produces water. Thirsty people need water. The system works when the product reaches the people who need it. If Mercer's distribution is failing, we adjust the delivery model. We don't need a blockade for that. We need a second delivery point." Harkin stared at me. I could see the confrontation he'd scripted. The demands, the threats, the escalation he'd rehearsed during the drive. Collapsing as the object of his anger refused to materialize. He'd come prepared to fight an adversary and found a vendor. We loaded 50 gallons onto his truck. Tomoko logged it. Harkin's people drank from the first container before they'd even cleared the gate. That evening, Mercer arrived with fury in his posture and control in his voice. "You traded with a splinter faction," he said, "without consulting me. We provided water to dehydrated people. Consultation would have added 12 hours, during which someone's kidneys might have failed. You undermined my authority. Your authority failed to deliver water to a quarter of your own coalition. We didn't undermine it. We routed around it." Mercer processed this. I watched the calculation happen. The cost of confrontation versus the cost of adaptation, measured against the strategic reality that his coalition was fragmenting along exactly the fault lines Osei had predicted. "How do we fix this?" he asked. The question was genuine, stripped of performance. Distributed delivery points. 3 locations supplied directly by us, accessible to all subgroups within your coalition independently. Removes the bottleneck. Removes the power that controlling distribution gives to any single person, including him. He heard that. He heard it clearly. "Do it," he said, and walked away into the dark. Day 70 changed the mathematics entirely. Asa, the teenager from Elige who'd first reached us on a bicycle, arrived again, this time in a truck with 2 other people and a piece of information that reframed everything we'd built. A settlement in Chattanooga had restored partial function to a municipal water treatment plant. They were producing clean water at a volume that dwarfed our output by orders of magnitude, and they were broadcasting their capability on shortwave radio, inviting trade and alliance with any group within reach. Our monopoly on clean water was over before we'd known it existed. The reaction inside the plant was immediate and divided. Kellen argued this was purely positive. More clean water in the region meant fewer desperate people and less pressure on us. Grace disagreed. If Chattanooga could produce water cheaply at scale, our trade partners would shift their resources north and our incoming diesel, food, and ammunition would dry up. Osei saw a security implication. If our value to surrounding groups diminished, so did their incentive to participate in the mutual defense agreements that kept us safe. Tomoko ran the numbers on the whiteboard, and the numbers were unambiguous. At Chattanooga's reported production rate, every settlement within 100 miles would have access to cheaper water within weeks. Our trade volume would drop by at least 60%. Our diesel reserves would last 45 days at current consumption. After that, the generator stops. After the generator stops, the pumps stop. After the pumps stop, we're drinking from the well with a bucket, just like everyone else. "We knew this was coming," Odell said. Everyone turned to him. He was sitting in his usual spot, a low stool near the fabrication bench, hands resting on his knees. Any factory that makes one product is one innovation away from obsolescence. I watched it happen in Dalton 3 times. Shops that made one thing perfectly went under when someone else made it cheaper. Shops that adapted survived. Adapted how? Ray asked. Made something else. Something the new competitor couldn't. The room went quiet as the implications settled. not quiet with despair. Quiet with a particular concentration that precedes invention. "What can we make?" I asked. Not rhetorically, directly, to every person in the room. The answers came fast. "Ray, the electrolysis setup can produce more than bleach. Modify the electrode configuration, and we can generate hydrogen peroxide, medical-grade antiseptic. No one between here and Chattanooga has that. Grace, the pasteurizer can process more than water. Run milk through it. Goat milk from the feral herds in the foothills. And you have safe dairy. Run fruit juice through it. You have preserved beverages with caloric value. Kellen, the air handling system's filtration technology can be miniaturized. Build portable positive pressure units for medical tents, and you solve the infection control problem that's killing people in every field hospital in the Southeast. Fitz, I can build mobile water carts from vehicle frames. Hook them to the pasteurizer, fill them, drive them anywhere. Turn delivery into a service instead of a pickup. Tomoko, diversification eliminates single-point dependency. Multiple product lines mean multiple trade relationships mean multiple resource inputs. The ledger gets deeper, not narrower. Odell nodded slowly at each answer, and I realized he hadn't been asking because he didn't know. He'd been prompting because the answers needed to come from the group, not from one person. A system that depends on a single mind is as fragile as a system that depends on a single product. I looked at Hannah, who was writing furiously in her logbook. She caught my eye and held it. "You should note the date," I said. "Day 70, the day the factory became a factory." She smiled. The first full, unguarded smile I'd seen from her. And wrote something I didn't read until much later. When I finally did, weeks afterward, the entry said, "Day 70, we stopped surviving. We started building." Those are different verbs, and they make different people. She was 14 years old, and she understood the transformation better than anyone. The retooling took 3 weeks. Ray reconfigured the electrolysis lab to produce hydrogen peroxide in controlled batches, a painstaking process that required precise voltage regulation using components Fitz stripped from vehicle alternators. The first successful batch yielded 4 liters of 3% solution, which Osei's medics immediately used to treat an infected wound on a sentry's forearm that had been resisting every other treatment they had. The wound began closing within 2 days. Kellen built the first portable positive pressure unit from a box fan, HEPA filters salvaged from the plant's air handling spares, and a plywood frame. It was ugly. It was loud. And when the Jasper Settlement's doctor, a retired pediatrician named Vera Moss, who'd been treating patients in a school gymnasium with no infection control whatsoever, saw it working, she traded us a month's worth of canned food for 3 units and asked for 6 more. Grace and Tomoko identified a goat herd in the hills outside Fairmount and negotiated with a solitary rancher named Culp, who'd been subsisting on raw goat milk and boiled acorns. We offered him a permanent place in the network. Milk supplied to the plant for pasteurization, clean water and bleach and antiseptic returned to his ranch. Security patrols extended to cover his property line. He agreed with the suspicious caution of a man who'd been alone too long, and then he delivered 12 gallons the next morning. Pasteurized goat milk. I stood on the production floor and watched it run through the heat exchanger, the same machine that had once processed sugared water for plastic bottles and emerged sterile and safe into food-grade containers. Marin was the first to try it. She pronounced it weird but good, and the review stood as our official quality assessment. The network grew, not explosively. We couldn't scale production that fast, but steadily, each new connection adding both demand and supply in a ratio that Tomoko monitored obsessively. The Chattanooga plant, rather than rendering us obsolete, became a complementary node. They produced water. We produced everything else. 2 settlements began trading between us, carrying Chattanooga water south and our antiseptic and dairy north. And a corridor of relative safety formed along the route, as every community along it developed a vested interest in keeping the road clear. Mercer's coalition stabilized once the distributed delivery system removed the internal power struggle over water access. Harkin, surprisingly, became one of our most reliable trade partners. His group focused on scavenging industrial components from abandoned manufacturing sites across northwest Georgia, feeding our production lines with raw materials in exchange for finished goods. The man who'd arrived at our gate with an ultimatum and 8 guns now arrived weekly with a truck full of copper wire and stainless steel fittings, and conducted his transactions through Tomoko's ledger with the diligence of a reformed accountant. The infected remained. They were always there. In the tree lines, on the roads at night, occasionally testing the perimeter in 1s and 2s. Osei security teams handled them with practiced efficiency, using the CO2 systems for close encounters and simple barricade maintenance for the rest. The threat hadn't diminished. We hadn't cured anything or solved the underlying catastrophe. The world was still broken, still dangerous, still populated by millions of reanimated dead. But inside the network we'd built, the nature of daily existence had shifted from reactive to productive. People woke up and went to work. They operated machinery, maintained systems, transported goods, kept records, stood watch, raised children. The work was harder than anything any of them had done before the collapse, and it was sustained by a fragility that never fully left anyone's awareness. One major system failure, one coordinated attack, one uncontrollable outbreak inside the perimeter, and the whole structure could come apart. It didn't come apart, not because it was invulnerable, but because every person inside it understood that the structure was the product, not water, not bleach, not antiseptic. The system itself, the web of mutual dependencies that made each person essential to every other person, was what we manufactured. And demand for that product never decreased. I still walk the production floor at night, not from anxiety, though that never fully leaves, but from something closer to verification. I put my hand on the pasteurizer housing and feel the residual warmth. I check the holding tank sight glass and watch the water level sit steady. I read the whiteboard where Tomoko's handwriting has been joined by Grace's and Hana's and a dozen others, a palimpsest of daily operations layered over months of continuous function. Odell told me once that a factory isn't a building. It's a process that happens to be housed in one. The building can burn. The process survives as long as the people who understand it survive. I think about that when I look south toward Atlanta's glow. Dimmer now. The fires consuming less remains. The world out there is still unrecognizable. The dead still walk. The living still struggle. Nothing we've built here reverses that. But on the production floor, the conveyor belt runs. Not 6 inches and a stop. A continuous forward motion, carrying product from one station to the next. Each station staffed, each person necessary, the line unbroken. My name is Dara Boone. I used to be an engineer. Now I'm a manufacturer, and the line is running.